Now we move on to privatization and public enterprises. So first let's take a look at SOEs, state-owned enterprises. So SOEs are seen as crucial for newly independent states to distance themselves from colonial rule and counter capitalist threats to state control. Private firms are often viewed as inefficient or controlled by the elite, and their macroeconomic objectives were the provision of essential goods or services, employment, and managed investment channels. There was a distrust of markets due to concerns over profit motives, capital flight, and wasteful private sector practices, and they aimed to prevent corruption, fraud, and theft through state control, and they focused on redistributing wealth, raising savings, and directing investments toward development goals, for example, training, tech, etc. And then in terms of privatization, poor development outcomes were blamed on government mismanagement and resource draining parastatals. So market efficiency was deemed superior to state failures, so corruption, principal agent problems, etc. And they thought it may reduce political manipulation, rent seeking, and inefficiency while generating government revenue and attracting investment. And so competition was idealized as a driver of efficiency. But now let's take a look at the limitations of privatization metrics. So the focus is on the number and value of privatizations rather than their broader economic impact, so the GDP growth, welfare, distributional effects, etc. Privatization generates one-time revenue spikes, but government spending is steady and growing, so it's not volatile. And the measurement of privatization metrics doesn't look at how the businesses are supported, for example, regulation, competition, and institutional support. The effects on prices, employment, and consumer access are hard to measure. And alternatives exist between full state control and privatization, for example, joint ventures, partial privatization, franchises, subsidies, etc. And we should know that SOEs and private enterprises want the same thing. They don't seek the opposite. State investment can crowd in the private sector, and private firms invest in state-protected sectors. And state withdrawal can lead to predatory commercialization, for example, no public safeguards. But now let's take a look at the differences between the influences in private firms and SOEs. So in terms of SOEs and voice, there is no voice. Complaints or lobbying is possible with relevant government agencies though. In terms of exiting, consumers can't vote, and SOEs may have a monopoly in goods and services, or competition may be restricted. In terms of bankruptcies, SOEs don't get bankrupt, although SOEs are recipients of government support, and government finances aren't infinite. And with SOEs, there's no risk of takeover. And then in terms of private firms, shareholders do have a voice. Consumers can exit the market, but the firm may have a monopoly if startup costs are high. Bankruptcy is possible, but some firms are protected in the national interest, for example, defense. And there is a risk of takeover, but not all inefficient firms are taken over. But now let's rethink the state versus market debate. So the best form of ownership, state, private, or hybrid, depends on the context. Neither guarantees efficiency or equity. The goal shouldn't be reducing state capacity, but leveraging both state and market roles effectively. The focus should be on outcomes, attracting investment, domestic and foreign, providing services, goods, creating jobs, and fostering skills, not just privatization metrics. Outcomes depend on what's produced and institutional conditions. For example, weak institutions complicate regulation. Economic development levels, sector-specific needs, and institutional diversity are often ignored, and domestic, not foreign investment is critical for developing countries. Now let's talk about technology. So technology is the body of knowledge and information used systematically for producing goods and services. It could be incorporated in machinery, for example, tools or artifacts, or unincorporated, for example, intellectual property or tacit knowledge in individuals or organizations. And then innovation is the implementation of new or significantly improved products, processes, marketing methods, or organizational practices. Now let's talk a bit about the catching up problem. Developing countries face challenges in entering globally competitive production at high quality levels, spreading technological capabilities broadly to create jobs, and moving up the equality ladder for sustained wage and productivity growth. But now let's take a look at some of the challenges of technology acquisition. While you could overestimate the ease of adopting off-the-shelf technologies from developed countries, technology transfer requires learning and internalizing foreign knowledge, which is complex and demanding. Policymakers often fail to fully grasp these dynamics, leading to ineffective industrial policies. And now let's take a look at the three key requirements for technology acquisition. Well, first is the absorptive capacity. So this is the ability to utilize foreign technology, requiring process optimization and maintenance efforts. There's also interaction and linkages, for example, collaboration with suppliers, firms, research institutions, and government to build capabilities and share knowledge. And then we have government support through education, R&D subsidies, knowledge dissemination, coordination, and protection from global competition. But now let's take a look at the four factors determining technology transfer, which is different from technology acquisition. Well, the first factor is the nature of the technology, so the complexity, novelty, speed of change, R&D centralization, and type. For example, product versus process. And then we take a look at the strategy of the seller, so the firm size, product concentration, brand dependency, experience in transfer, and strategic culture. And then we take a look at the buyer's capabilities, so the skills, knowledge, and assets required to absorb the technology. And then finally, there's government policy and locational factors, so interventions to reduce costs, infrastructure like standards, R&D labs, education, and industry linkages. But what are the phases of technological change? Well, first is invention, so the creation of new ideas. Then innovation, so the commercialization of inventions, so products or processes. And then diffusion, so market adoption, so the realized impact. Let's take a look at the types of innovation. So first we take a look at the scope along the value chain, so production, design, distribution, or marketing. Then we see if it's technological, so new technology, versus non-technological, so organizational or managerial. And then there's incremental innovation, so improvements, versus radical innovation, which is transformative. We also have social innovation for addressing societal challenges. But what are latecomer firms? Well, these are firms entering markets later, initially competing on low costs. They're usually disadvantaged by distance from tech sources, although it's less relevant today due to ICT. There's cost-based competition early on. They're usually historically late entrants, and the strategic intent is to catch up. But now let's talk a bit about the research focus in advanced versus emerging economies. So in terms of advanced economies, these are firms at the technological frontier. So there's high research and development and patents. And the research focuses on pushing the boundaries of innovation. And now in emerging economies, there's limited formal innovation capabilities. The focus is on imitation and then innovation, and learning mechanisms to build capabilities. And so technological learning, TL, is the process of converting individual knowledge into organizational capabilities. And then technological capabilities, TC, is the resources needed to manage technical change. And so the theoretical relationship is that we have technological learning, which would be internal learning, and then this would lead to technological capabilities, so process capabilities, and then this would lead to innovation, so process improvements. So internal learning, and then process capabilities, and then process improvements. Now let's take a look at these sources of technological learning. So internal sources could be formal, like R&D and training, and informal, like learning by doing. Then we have external sources from clients, suppliers, competitors, or universities, etc. And in terms of the phases of learning progression, you go from basic, learning by doing, or reverse engineering, and then intermediate, so imitation and copying, and then advanced forms. And so active learning is firm-driven, for example, research and development and strategic partnerships. And passive learning has minimal firm involvement, for example, incidental knowledge absorption. And we should know technological capabilities are the combination of equipment, skills, and knowledge to operate, adapt, and innovate. Let's take a look at the types of technological capabilities. Well, first we have R&D specific capabilities, which are focused on creating and applying new knowledge, for example, innovation design. And then we have non-R&D capabilities, like operating and production, using existing systems efficiently, design and engineering, D&E, which would be reconfiguring knowledge for new or improved systems. But then how do you acquire design and engineering capabilities? Well, you have formal education, so foundational technical training, for example, universities. And then you have experience-based learning. This could be enterprise-led, so specialized training, externally or internally developed, or firm-specific, so highly tailored in-house training unique to firms' needs. But now let's take a look at the key capabilities for firm development. Well, first we have production capabilities, so these skills and knowledge to operate, maintain, and improve production systems. So this would be technical understanding of processes and machinery, efficiency optimization with cost, time, capacity, or waste reduction, and maintenance of equipment and systems. And then we have investment capabilities, so the ability to identify, evaluate, and integrate new technologies and equipment. So here you'd have financial analysis, so cost benefit of investments, the management of technology adoption from procurement to operational integration, and balancing upgrades, new versus existing systems. And then we have linking capabilities, networking with external entities, private, public, or international, to access resources, knowledge, and collaboration. And so the non-technical linking capabilities could be market intelligence, policy insights, or financing. And then the technical linking capabilities could be technology transfer from universities or suppliers, etc. And then we take a look at organizational capabilities. So this is administrative and managerial effectiveness to support innovation and operations. So this would be tacit knowledge embedded in routines, so learning by doing, and managerial innovation, for example, R&D coordination or consumer targeting, etc., as well as adaptation to local conditions. And then finally, we have marketing capabilities, so leveraging linkages for market expansion and intelligence. So this involves distribution channel management and consumer service and market development. Now we take a look at industrial policy. Industrial policy is government intervention to shape economic sectors for productivity, competitiveness, and structural transformation. So the state selects industries to achieve economy-wide efficiency. There's coordination of policies to boost productivity or competitiveness, and the focus is on catching up and shifting to high-tech or innovation-driven activities. And then in terms of the types of industrial policy, we have selective policy. So this targets specific sectors or firms, for example, subsidies. We have horizontal policies. This is cross-sector support, for example, R&D incentives and training. And then functional policies. This improves market operations, for example, competition or trade policies. We also have mission-oriented industrial policy, and this is focused on societal challenges, for example, climate change or AI, to spur innovation across sectors. So here you'd be picking the willing, so collaborators, versus picking the winners. And so the neoliberal opposition is that industrial policy distorts markets and encourages rent-seeking. And they say the best industrial policy is no industrial policy, in line with the Washington Consensus. But the post-2008 bailouts prove that industrial policy is still relevant. In terms of the policy design principles, there's market shaping, so proactive direction setting versus reactive fixing. And then we have institutional tools like public finance, procurement, outcome-focused measures. Then we have symbiotic public-private partnerships, so PPPs. Then we also have co-creation, so stakeholder participation to build trust, as well as dynamic capabilities, strengthening state implementation capacity. When we talk about the rise of the West, we're talking about the East Asian success in the 1970s. So manufacturing experience and tacit knowledge were key to success, often tied to nationalism, so Japan, South Korea, etc. And so the revisionist neoclassical industrial policy addresses market failures, information asymmetries, and imperfect competition. And we have industrial policy as a self-discovery process where state and private sector collaborate. And so neoclassical industrial policy critiques the Washington Consensus, emphasizing industrial policy to correct market failures. And there's a focus on unconditional convergence in manufacturing and limited industrial policy for self-discovery. And then we also take a look at Justin Lin's New Structural Economics. So post-2008, industrial policy gained traction but differs from East Asian models due to global value chains and the World Trade Organization constraints. And so New Structural Economics advocates state facilitation of comparative advantages, subtly limiting state intervention. So then what is the relevance of old-style industrial policy in the global value chain era? While industrial policy resurfaced after structural adjustment programs led to deindustrialization, challenges included adapting industrial policy to fragmented production networks and new industries, for example, green industrialization. But now let's take a look at ISI versus EOI strategies. So import substitution industrialization, ISI, and export-oriented industrialization, EOI strategies are not opposing. ISI was used in Latin America and EOI was used in East Asia. Effective industrial policy requires targeted protection with performance conditions, feedback mechanisms, and adaptability. Let's take a look at trade policy as industrial policy. While the neoclassical perspective is that free trade promotes development by leveraging comparative advantage, so specialization leads to efficient factor use, and imports of capital goods means technology transfer. And so the policy challenge here is discovering latent comparative advantage and incentivizing free trade and investment. And so the heterodox perspective or the Listian view is that trade policy must be strategically shaped by industrial policy to build comparative advantage in key sectors. And so trade policy should protect and conditionally support target industries to ensure learning. And so the policy challenge here is designing a coherent strategy and aligning instruments, for example, tariffs and subsidies. But now let's take a look at hard versus soft industrial policy. So hard industrial policy involves direct interventions, for example, tariffs, subsidies, local content rules, etc. But the risks here are rent seeking, misaligned business and state interest, and weak institutional capacity. And then we have soft industrial policy. So this involves indirect support, for example, special economic zones, trade infrastructure, and export credit. This is seen as lower risk but may lack transformative impact. Hard industrial policy requires strong rents management to avoid unproductive protectionism, and developing states often lack capacity to enforce performance conditions. But now let's take a look at the risks of no industrial policy or passive comparative advantage following. So horizontal policies, for example, infrastructure, are necessary but insufficient. The dangers include deindustrialization, so the focus is on low value added goods, weak technology transfer without state pressure, and a race to the bottom in labor or tax standards. But now let's also take a look at Ricardian versus Kaldorian growth strategies. So in terms of Ricardian, growth is driven by existing comparative advantage, for example, capital access, market expansion, etc. And the constraints here is weak property rights and limited investment. And then in terms of Kaldorian, here we have growth via developed comparative advantage. And so here we have state-led learning and productivity gains. And the tools we have here are export pressures, local content rules, R&D incentives, etc. But now let's talk about Hirschman's argument with the high road. The high road relating to increasing returns to scale. So here it says that technologically complex projects may seem unfit for developing countries, but are crucial for learning by doing. And success brings not just output, but institutional and human capital transformation. But now let's take a look at the worker's role in learning and productivity. So low wages and job insecurity hinder learning. Low-wage economies often have high unit costs due to low productivity, but higher wages reduce turnover, retain skills, and boost productivity. But there are some competing views in terms of raising productivity. The mainstream view held by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund is that the focus should be on education, governance, and labor discipline, so low wages and flexibility. But then the emerging industrial policy literature is saying that exporting and FDI spillovers, if linked to local firms, drive learning. And we also have agglomeration economies, so proximity to firms boosts productivity. Learning by doing is costly, but it's essential, so tacit knowledge. Let's talk about learning by doing at the firm level. So productivity grows through hands-on experience and not just formal education. Tacit knowledge is the uncodified skills gained through practice, adaptation, and experimentation. But now let's take a look at the productivity ladder. So the first step is simple manufacturing, so foreign direct investment and foreign guidance. And then the second step is the development of supporting industries with tech from licensing and spillovers from foreign firms. The third step would be domestic high quality production. And then the fourth and last step would be domestic innovation in processes and products. But now let's talk a bit about policy learning and state capacity. So policy making as learning by doing requires adaptability and state-private collaboration. And some of the African challenges include the weak domestic capitalist class, so there's a reliance on FDI, and state capacity is eroded by structural adjustment programs and NGO dominance. And we should know that industrial policy is political, and success depends on state vision, enforcement capacity and autonomy, and the ability to mediate conflicts amongst interest groups. So it needs rents management and ensuring that rents promote learning, for example, technological capabilities and productivity growth. In terms of the class dynamics and industrial policy, the state must leverage policy instruments to reshape socioeconomic relations. It requires altering the distribution of economic benefits, often facing social resistance. And so the key challenges are balancing competing class interests, for example, capital versus labor versus foreign firms, and governments must enforce contested decisions to drive structural transformation. But now let's touch on institutional mechanisms and state capacity. In terms of the developmental state, technocratic elites are insulated from short-term pressures. And then in terms of bureaucratic shareholder regimes, there's collaborative governance but is vulnerable to elite capture. So we'd need to learn rents management, and we'd have the Weberian bureaucracy, which is meritocratic and autonomous to design and monitor industrial policy. And now let's take a look at the World Trade Organization rules and industrial policy constraints. So in terms of its impact on industrial policy instruments, it highly constrains tariffs and local content rules. It moderately constrains export subsidies and government procurement. And it constrains trade finance, investment incentives, and export taxes the least. But now let's take a look at industrialization in South Africa. So pre-democracy industrialization was rooted in the mining energy complex, MEC, and it was dominated by mining gold, energy, and semi-processed manufacturers like steel or petrochemicals. And we had state-led industrialization, so SOEs like Eskom, Sasol, etc. built the MEC to reduce foreign dependence and create Afrikaner jobs. We had the systematic suppression of black capital accumulation, and there was a conflict between English mining capital and Afrikaner political control. And so the dominant view is that apartheid growth slowed due to failed ISI, so import substitution industrialization, due to incoherent tariffs, labor rigidities, and financial suppression. The MEC mining energy complex succeeded in narrow terms. The apartheid state achieved hard ISI, so capital goods, but not easy ISI, so consumer goods. But now let's take a look at post-apartheid industrialization. So in terms of the global context, we had financialization. So there was dominance of finance over industry, offshore listings, and capital flight. And there was also liberalization, so trade openness, inflation targeting, and BEE, which is focused on ownership transfer. And so the key outcomes was deindustrialization, so manufacturing stagnation, MEC dominance, and weak diversification. We also had corporate restructuring, so conglomerates were unbundled but rebundled around monopolistic cores, for example steel and petrochemicals. And then finally we had rent seeking. BEE was associated with tenderpreneurship, speculative deals, and unproductive rents. And so the policy challenges include currency volatility, so overvaluation hurts exports, infrastructure gaps like the electricity crisis and slow public investment, and financialization, so capital that's diverted to speculative uses over productive investment. But now let's take a look at the explanations for economic performance. Well, first we have market distortions. So this includes skills gaps, labor rigidities, BEE costs, and monopolistic markups. Another factor is government capacity. So we have weak state capability, corruption, and service delivery failures. There's also the political economy of rents. So we'd have financialization rents, and this is short-termism and shareholder value focused. And then we had primitive accumulation, so state-linked rents, for example BEE, without productive reinvestment. There's also the MEC's missed potential. It failed to leverage forward linkages or economies of scope. And finally, we had structural constraints. So the neoliberal reforms like trade or financial liberalization undermined industrialization. And there's a deep ambiguity about the importance of industrialization despite international evidence. Now we move on to labor theory and policy. So let's take a look at unemployment as an indicator. So unemployment rates are crude and not easily comparable across countries, especially in regions like Southern and Western Africa due to differences in informal versus formal sectors. It's designed for industrial societies, making it less suitable for developing countries where underemployment is more relevant than unemployment. Official definitions may exclude discouraged workers, leading to underreporting. Self-employment is often misclassified as a residual category, ignoring structural change or informal economies. And many rely on multiple income sources, complicating household definitions of employment. So a labor market is a place where labor services are bought and sold. This might be an oversimplification though, because there's information asymmetries and power imbalances. The ALMP, the active labor market policies, help people find work. But now let's take a look at the measurement methods for employment. Well, we have the usual principal status, UPS, which is based on annual engagement in economic activities. Then we have the current weekly status, CWS, which uses a reference period of 7 days to determine the current activity status, and there needs to be at least 1 hour of work in a week. And then we have the current daily status, CDS, which tracks hours worked daily. For example, 1 to 4 hours worked is equal to a half day employed. And then we should know underemployment occurs when workers can't secure the desired hours. For example, wanting 6 days but only getting 4. The current measurement methods miss nuances like multiple jobs or seasonal work. And the solutions could be combining methods, the UPS, the CWS, and the CDS for holistic insights, or we could use open-ended questions to capture occupation details, wages, and employer relations. We could also address biases, for example, underreporting stigmatized jobs, and also adapting categories to local context and including qualitative research, for example, employment industries. Now let's talk a bit about populism and neoliberalism. So inclusive neoliberalism has a shift from market-centric policies with the Washington Consensus to poverty reduction and social inclusion with the post-Washington Consensus, for example, microfinance. And then the populist narratives emphasize solidarity of the poor and DIY solutions, for example, land reform and community projects. Now let's take a look at the neoclassical view of labor markets. While here, labor is a commodity with supplier-demand determined wages. Human capital, education or skills drives labor outcomes. And here, unemployment stems from artificially high wages, for example, minimum wage laws. And so the solution is to deregulate labor markets to restore equilibrium. But this ignores power dynamics, institutional barriers, and non-market factors shaping employment. Now let's take a look at neoclassical's human capital theory. While it says skills determine earnings, so higher education or training leads to higher wages. And it says unemployment is an employability problem, for example, South Africa's skills shortage. But the critiques are that it's reductionist. It treats education as purely vocational, ignoring its social, cultural, and personal roles. It also ignores structural factors. It overlooks how race, gender, unions, and historical factors skew outcomes. It assumes a perfect market, but conditioning variables, for example, discrimination, have big impacts. And it frames education as a calculable investment, neglecting broader societal benefits. But now let's take a look at the political economy of labor markets. So labor markets reflect power dynamics and not just supplier demand. Wages are tied to the socially necessary labor time to produce goods and services to reproduce workers. Capitalism relies on surplus extraction, for example, longer hours, productivity boosts, or mechanization. Capital-labor conflict manifests in industrial disputes, casualization, and outsourcing. But now let's take a look at the political economy of labor markets in South Africa. While apartheid-era on-the-job learning for black workers was systematically devalued and unaccredited, education system inefficiencies still persist, exacerbating skills mismatches, and colonial and post-colonial labor systems relied on coercion, for example, migrant labor and racialized hierarchies. So if we take a look at the capital-wage labor relation, capitalism systematically exploits workers through economic coercion rather than direct force. Workers depend on wages for survival, ensuring perpetual subjugation to capital. If we take a look at labor markets in practice, we have efficiency wages. So some firms may pay above market wages to boost productivity, for example, multinationals versus local firms. And we have segmentation. Labor markets are divided by gender, skills, industry, and unionization, creating unequal power dynamics. Now let's take a look at the global labor force trends. So first we have rising inequality. Productivity gains disproportionately benefit capital, and real wages stagnate or decline for the poorest. And then we also have casualization. Short-term contracts, fake self-employment, and part-time work reduces job security. And then we also have depeasantization, which drives mobility and labor force migration. And so employment alone doesn't eliminate poverty, and capitalism's failure to absorb labor leads to informal sector growth. But now, what are the effects of neoliberal globalization? While in general we have worsening labor conditions, So first we have a declining wage share. Workers' share of national income has fallen since the 70s. Then we have informalization. There's a rise of casual labor and self-employment. And then surplus labor pools in China and India suppress wages and worker bargaining power. But now let's take a look at the rise and fall of trade unions. So post 1945 we had a rise. Unions gained power through collective bargaining, lobbying, and regulating labor supply to improve wages or security. And then we had the neoliberal erosion from the 1970s to now. Trade unions were demonized as rigidities, leading to decline in collective bargaining and a shift to individual or firm-level deals, and unions became institutionalized. But now let's take a look at South Africa's labor market crisis. Well, we have chronic unemployment and underinvestment, and the root causes are deindustrialization, reliance on FDI, neoliberal policies, and capital-intensive industries, for example, mining and manufacturing. And then we have a growth in service sector jobs, which are low-wage and insecure, and casualization with part-time and quote-unquote self-employment. Labor laws inadvertently increase temporary work, reducing permanent jobs. And then we also have structural barriers, for example, black tax, spatial inequality, and skilled migration from Zim or Congo, etc., suppressing wages. And so poverty reduction requires fair wages and worker voice. Some potential solutions could be industrial policy, stimulating labor-intensive sectors to absorb workers, and also land reform, reviving small-scale agriculture to reduce wage dependence.